Here we go. All right, so hello everyone. Today we are joined with Don Preston, who heads up the Preterism Research Institute over there in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Don, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it very much.
So, preterism is a topic that I just find incredibly fascinating. I've heard you before describe eschatology as this final frontier in theology, and I really feel that energy. I remember for me just wondering about the time statements in particular, and just that question, that harrowing question, you know, in the first sense, or in the ancient antiquity when Jesus first arrived in the first century, people missed it. People did not see that Jesus had arrived the first time. And it made me think, my goodness, what if there was a return and perhaps we were so calloused or disorientated that we were not sensitive to it? And then I found, language in the scripture that says, the kingdom does not come with observation. And Paul's saying we look to things unseen. And it made me think, am I being far too materialistic? Am I being far too physical? And one of the things I sometimes delve into, I don't know if I'm going too deep, is, I feel like the Enlightenment and the toolkit that the Enlightenment gives us, using reason, logic, empirical evidence, it can maybe sometimes push us towards a firm materialism that I think desensitizes us to the spiritual reality. And perhaps we were wrong to kind of shear off romanticism from the kind of Western mindset. And not to go too deep into that, but I feel like there's something to that. And so when I was looking for someone to get me guidance, when I jumped online, it was Don Preston that showed up. You know what I mean? Don Preston answered the call. And I'm kind of curious, what was your journey into preterism? Because am I right in understanding that you had a ministry, or you were in a particular church and you were doing your thing? And I'm just wondering, what was that journey like for you? Because if you were brought up in a more kind of traditional futuristic perspective, I imagine that might have caused some inner turmoil.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Yes, I was raised as a fifth generation member of the amillennial view of eschatology. That says that essentially we are in the millennium right now. There is no literal 1,000-year reign, and Christ will come at the end of the Christian age, at the end of time, and then we enter into heaven. And I was perfectly happy. I never challenged it. When I graduated from seminary, I went directly into a preaching job in a place called Shawnee, Oklahoma, which is about 90 miles north of me right now. Wonderful, wonderful congregation. And one of the very first assignments that I had was to teach a ladies' Bible class. It was held every Thursday. And so they were finishing up on one study. And so when it came my time to take that over, I asked them, I said, what would you like for me to teach? And they said, we want you to teach the Olivet Discourse. Well, in my upbringing, the tradition of the amillennial view was that Matthew chapter 24 and 25 is divided into two subjects. Number one, the fall of Jerusalem that occurred in AD 70. And number two, the end of time.
Yeah.
That I believe that, I espouse that, at least to a certain extent. Although, one little caveat here, my father, who's a minister, he struggled with the Olivet Discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And he struggled with eschatology. And I remember him saying many, many times, well, I don't know what to think about the Olivet Discourse, because Matthew 24, 29 to 31 predicted the coming of the Lord in Jesus' own words. But verse 34 says he was going to come back in that generation. I know he didn't do that, but I don't know what the answer is. He struggled with that.
Yeah.
And I always considered my father an excellent Bible student. So my early impression was, well, if my dad doesn't have the answers, how am I supposed to have the answers? And when I got into seminary, some of my professors had the same feeling of confusion and consternation. So when the ladies there at that congregation asked me if I would teach the Olivet Discourse, I said, well, I will, but you have to give me 1 year to study so that I can make up my own mind what I actually believe. I know what the commentaries say. I know what our church teaches. I know what tradition says. I don't want to just present that without believing it. I want to know what I believe and why.
Yeah.
And to be honest, they were a little taken back by that. They said, well, you're fresh out of preacher school. You're supposed to have the answers. Well, I didn't, but they gave me a year. And to be honest about it, it didn't take me long in doing my own independent research to come to the realization that there are not two subjects in Matthew 24 and 25. There's but one.
Mm-hmm.
And that Jesus and his apostles were talking about the end of the old covenant age at his coming at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And yeah, that was unsettling.
And I think that's important for people to learn, you know, is to get to know you and what you're doing now, because it's not like you came out of the womb a cheerleader for preterism. It's more like, you know, it's the opposite's true. You're talking 5 generations, you know, and so you're confronted with this. And I mean, it's that thing where you see it with your own eyes and then you start to feel it. And I feel like you're like, oh, okay, I can see I'm on a roller coaster here. But what I really respect about you, Don, is that you have pursued what you believe to be true. You've demonstrated it, I think, persuasively, and you've followed it regardless of the costs. You know, you don't seem like someone that's particularly interested in whatever kind of capital can be accrued from sitting on the mainstream. You don't seem like that type of guy. You seem like someone who's much more into, right, I want to know what the truth of this matter is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I've likened it before when I've mentioned you. I think you do some mechanic stuff, don't you? You like to fix cars, don't you?
Oh, yes.
And I think that speaks to the mentality. There's someone that likes to get in there, see what's going on under the hood, break it down. Like, what's actually happening here, you know? And I really like that. I can see how those skills would kind of blend into each other. So, what would you say was, if I had to put you on the spot and say, what's the most persuasive argument for preterism? I mean, for you, or perhaps what you've heard from people, what do you think that one persuasive argument is, if that exists?
I wrote an article some years ago entitled An Irrefutable Argument. It's found on my website, donkpreston.com, nice. And eschatology.org. Just do a search for irrefutable argument. I was reading Matthew 16, 27 and 28 for about the millionth time.
Yes.
Now, in my tradition, in the churches of Christ, Matthew 16, 27 and 28 are divided. Here Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. Verse 28, and verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, okay. In my traditional upbringing, verse 27 is applied to the end of time. Verse 28 is applied to the day of Pentecost. And just on the structure of the text grammatically, that's troublesome. How do you insert a 2,000-year gap in the period at the end of verse 27? I mean, but again, that's the way I was raised. And all of the prominent preachers that I knew and that I respected, that's the way they taught it. And for many years, as a very young man, my attitude was, well, these are my theological heroes. These are men with their PhDs. I mean, surely they can't be wrong.
Uh-huh.
And I began to break down the text one day. I began to look at the Greek text. I'm not a Greek scholar, but I'm competent enough to use the lexicons, to use the grammars, and I'm certainly competent enough to look at the context of Scripture. Mm-hmm. And so as I began to look at it, I realized that grammatically, I'm talking actual grammar of the text. You cannot divide verse 27 from verse 28. Let me explain why.
Hmm.
Verse 28 begins with the little Greek term, amin, lego, humin. That little term is used something like 88 times, I believe it is, in the New Testament, all in the epistles, all in the Gospels, excuse me. Not one single time does it break a subject. Not one time does it change a subject. It is used invariably to call attention to what is about to be said that will emphasize something that's just been said. That means that verse 28 is emphasizing verse 27. So that means the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man. And now pay really, really, really close attention. Some standing here will not taste of death until they see this take place.
Hmm.
That was a revolutionary moment in my thinking.
I mean, that it just sounds. I mean, that sounds characteristic as well. It sounds like you're under the hood. You're figuring out stuff there that someone like such as myself, looking into the grammar and the structure and the original language. It might not be my first instinct to do that, but to know the work's done and to know now I can go and study these things myself. It's such a strong framework to base your faith in, and how you understand the narrative in the Bible. And I feel like, how can you insert 2,000 years between those two lines, between Matthew 16, 27, 28? How can you fit 2,000 years in there? And I think at this point, we both have come to an answer. And it's like an ideological allegiance. It's like your chips are on the table for a particular way of looking at this. There's a particular hermeneutic, and you're all in, kind of because you have to be if you want to be part of this, whatever it is, whatever church you belong to. And that, what you said about how can they be wrong? You look to people with their accolades, and you look to people in history, and you wonder, how can they be wrong? And then if you actually look a little bit closer, like you did with the grammar and the original language, you understand that, church history in general is sometimes a cascade of calamity where people have done wrong. You know what I mean? And it's not to say that good things haven't happened, that people haven't lived rich and wonderful spiritual lives. But in some instances, when it comes to understanding the narrative, just on the level of ideas and comprehending the story, I think you can miscomprehend. I think you can get it wrong in some of the details and still live a wonderful, enriching life, and have a great relationship with God. I don't think the Great Judgment's a theology test. You know what I mean? I think it's more, how did you live your life? But I think if we're being honest, we can see that even in church history, there have been some mistakes. I mean, just throw out a name. Is it William Tyndale? A man who tried to translate scripture, and that was a death penalty.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you think about things like that, and it makes you really sad. But at the same time, you remember, throughout history, even names that haven't been recorded, there's going to be good people there. And for the people that get it wrong, I mean, the early church fathers are one where I'll sit and I'll listen to a critic of Preterism, because they'll turn and say, look, we have these writings from Justin Martyr and Eusebius, and potentially there's a connection between the apostles there. I mean, a tenuous one, I don't know. It doesn't look particularly strong to me, but I listen to them because it's like, right, I understand where you're coming from, because on one level, it is quite surprising that these people so early into church history didn't seem to comprehend something so fundamental.
Right.
But then I remember, these are a select few writings from people around that time, and you might wonder, why have these been preserved, and what's going on? I don't know if you've sat with that and wrestled with that.
Oh, very much so. One of the questions that I receive constantly is, okay, if the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection occurred in AD 70, why didn't someone write about it? Look at the total silence that we have. And that is a perplexing question. And it's one that I have studied somewhat down through the years. But a tremendous thing happened in the very first century. And I'm talking in the 50s. It probably began earlier than that, and that was the Hellenization of the church.
Mm.
And there was one scholar, and I can quote several, but there was one scholar in particular by the name of Snyder, and I'll paraphrase it, very rough paraphrase, but he said, due to the Hellenization of the early church, the apocalyptic language of the Old Testament scriptures and even the New began to be literalized and taken as predictive of the end of the world, and not in a metaphoric way. And a literalistic interpretation was placed on that language that was never intended to be put on the language.
Mm-hmm.
So what Snyder is suggesting, and I think he's absolutely true, and I could provide a long list of scholars such as N.T. Wright, Tom Holland, Mark Nanos, and others who agree with that assessment, that at a very, very early stage in the life of the church, due to the conversion of Hellenistically trained pagans, when they came into the church, they lost the Hebraic understanding.
Yes.
And we have to understand that in the first century, even many of the regular rabbis, regular Jews, had also been Hellenized, so that there was a literalistic definition and hermeneutic being imposed on the Old Testament that was never valid in the first place. So what was the result of that? Well, we see that in Romans chapter 11, where Paul is writing to the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked the question, has God cast off his people whom he foreknew? Well, the Gentiles coming in were saying, Israel's day is over. Now God has turned to the Gentiles. And Paul saying, you're absolutely wrong. You're false. God is not yet through with Israel. Now, the termination of Israel's theocratic history was very close, within a generation, not a generation, but certainly a decade and a half at the most. But he was saying to them, look, you Gentiles have to understand, you don't have salvation if Israel's salvation is not brought to a completion and consummation. When would that consummation take place? At the coming of the Lord out of Zion.
Yeah.
And so what was happening, here's the logical implication of this. Mm-hmm. Those Gentiles in Rome, by saying that Israel's age was already over, they literally had to create another eschatology. And so what did they do? Whereas the Jews had more of a linear view of history, the Greeks had a cyclical view of history.
Okay.
And it was literalistic. Okay.
Yeah.
And so here they are. They've rejected the Jewish idea of eschatology found in the Tanakh, found in the Old Testament. Well, if you don't have a Jewish eschatology, you've got to create one. So they created a Hellenized, literalistic eschatology that anticipated not the end of the Old Covenant age, but the end of time.
That makes sense to me. And I think we can see clues of that interspersed into the New Testament. I always refer to this sort of Nicodemus type error, if I'm not mistaken, when Jesus describes the process of being born again, or just mentions Nicodemus thinks, should I climb into my mother's womb a second time and be born again? And I think sometimes this Hellenistic, over literalizing adherence to some kind of physicalism, we see that. And, for example, every eye will see him is often stressed by critics of preterism. And they're like, well, did every eye see him? And I think to myself, well, let me turn your attention to, Colossians 1:23, where Paul says that he's preached the gospel to every creature which is under heaven. And I'll suggest to them, do you take that? I mean, how do you understand that? And then we get into what did Paul say? Wait, what happens when the gospel goes out? I mean, like, once the gospel goes out, to every creature under heaven, I'm pretty sure that is a big trigger for the end, the imminency of the end, right?
Absolutely.
And so there's these ideas to think on, and perhaps we should understand that some hyperbole, some metaphor, some simile, this rich Hebraic language is sometimes falling onto ears that have been conditioned to hear it inappropriately. Our ears have been conditioned to interpret this in a Hellenized way, in an ultra enlightenment type way, where it's like, right, let's get the Bunsen burners out, let's get the beakers out, let's get the measuring tape out, and it's like, wait, no, this is the wrong toolkit. Let's try and understand this appropriate to the context. And I think, and I think you've been really, really good at showing people how that's done.
Let me throw something in here, because you mentioned something a moment ago, and I'm hit with this constantly by people. I have people just tell me, well, you're standing diametrically opposed to the early church writers. You stand opposed to the creeds. Well, point number one, even the Westminster Confession of Faith said the creeds have been wrong many, many times. Okay, well, since the Westminster Confession of Faith would even say the creeds have been wrong very often, and the ultimate authority is Scripture and Scripture alone, when people tell me, well, Preston, you're violating the creeds, I said, no. I'm doing exactly what the creeds tell me to do, and that's take Scripture above anything else. Mm-hmm. And secondly, when it comes to the early patristic writers, the early church writers, as they are known, they're called the patristics. Okay. Something that I would say 99.9% of most believers do not understand, and even the people who make a big deal of, well, you're at odds with the early church. They were all futurists. They believe this, they believe that. And my response to that is this. When you say all of the early writers believed such and such, you're making a statement that really honestly is ill-founded in facts. And here's the reason why. And this is what 99% of believers today do not understand. Only a tiny, tiny fraction of the writings of the early church writers have ever been translated. The huge majority, if memory serves me correctly, there's something like 188 Latin manuscripts and 388, something like that, 368 perhaps, Greek manuscripts, which amounts to, you got to catch the power of this, over 1 million pages.
Wow.
Now that's 1 million pages of early church writings which have never been translated.
Wow.
So when somebody tells me, well, Don, all of the early church writers believe this or believe that, et cetera, oh, wait a minute. How do you know? We only have this much. I mean, this much of the early church writings that have ever been translated. And not only that, while it's probably safe to say none of them were full preterists, at the same time, my question to people very commonly is, why would you put your faith in a group of people, number one, that are totally Hellenized, and number two, who are, I don't want to be disrespectful because I read the ancient writings, fairly common.
Yeah.
Commonly. But the more I read so many of the ancient writers, the more I believe they're a bunch of Fruit Loops.
I mean, I got a slight impression like that. I was reading some Justin Martyr. I was like, wow, this guy really seems to he really wants to get martyred quite badly. I was like, I think he's really trying.
Or Ignatius, at the turn of the 2nd century, Ignatius had been arrested by the Roman authorities and at the instigation of the Jews, but he was on his way to Rome. And all these churches along the way, some of whom had members that were quite influential with the Romans, they said, well, we'll get you released. And Ignatius says, no, don't do that. I want to die.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, whatever.
But I think that's the mentality, and I think we see it today. It's people wanting to, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I use this language to be a little bit provocative, to role play the first century, to role play it's 60 AD, to role play it's 40 AD, and it's like, and you see that with how people understand the epistles. It's like, oh, this is written to me.
Oh
This
yes.
is my letter, and it's like, no.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Uh, and once we learn, and well, this is one of the greatest challenges, and this is something that I talk about a great deal. Once we learn, point number one, what I just went over, there is a vast difference between the Hebraic worldview and the Grecian worldview.
Mm.
And let me cite just one scholar here. I've mentioned some of the others, but Richard Hayes is one of the foremost uh, biblical scholars of the day. I absolutely love his writings, but Richard Hayes points out, and Tom Holland does the same thing, that although the very earliest of the writers, even the apostolic writers, Barnabas and Hermas and what have you, even though they use the terminology of the scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures, they meant something totally different from what the original context demanded.
Hmm.
And that's because they were Hellenized.
Yeah.
And so here are these world renowned scholars saying, look, yeah, they're using the terminology of Isaiah. They're using the terminology of Malachi. They're using all of the words. They quote Barnabas, especially. And Barnabas is a fascinating book, absolutely fascinating. So they use all this terminology, but boy, they're putting a twist on it that when you go back to the context of the passages that they're citing, you're going, that's not even close to what it meant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's very, very troubling. The second point of it is something that you were touching on there a moment ago. We have a tendency to insert our own individual lives
Mm-hmm.
and our towns or whatever into the epistles written to people 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to tell an anecdote here, and it's radical. Okay, I want to say that right up front. It's the only time I've ever been told this just straight out. I was holding a conversation with a fellow some years ago, and every single passage that I quoted, he said, well, yeah, that applies to me. That's happening in my world. That's happening right here. And I go, wait a minute. I said, I want to make sure I'm understanding you. So I went to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, where Paul was writing to a church being persecuted by the Jews. And he says, it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, persecuting you, and to give to you who are being troubled relief when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven.
Mm.
I said, now, just so that I can understand you, are you saying that passage was written to Ardmore, Oklahoma,
Yeah.
and not to the church at Thessalonica 2,000 years ago? He said, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I said, wait a minute. Okay, wait a minute. It says to the church of God. He said, I don't care what it says. It was not really written to them. It was written to us today. I said, okay, look,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you and I really don't have anything to talk about here except hermeneutic. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Now, again, I understand, 99.9% of the people would not be that radical. Not explicitly, but implicitly they are.
Yeah.
Because how many times do we hear people say when we try to share the audience relevance of given text, and people say, oh, you're taking the Bible away from me.
Mm-hmm.
No, until we properly understand what it meant to the first readers.
Yes.
We can't know how to apply it to us.
It's so palpably true. It's such, and yeah, you're right. That is the kind of logical conclusion, is for this contingent of people waiting in expectancy of Christ's second coming. It's like you are essentially saying that these things are written to you, but look at the language that's used. Look what's been said to these particular people at this particular time. And for me, I think, like, I saw you in a debate recently with Chris Day, and it was the resurrection that was being described. And Chris had this idea that I'm going to look at the nature, I'm going to work out what the nature of the resurrection is, and then I'll have a look at the time framing. And I thought to myself, that's so backwards. Find out when it happens, and that's going to guide you a lot better. And so when I look at the book of Revelation, and I see in Revelation 1:1 book of things which must shortly come to pass. When I see Revelation 1:3, this has been written because the time is near, right there at the end of 1:3. And it's like, so you have your framing. This is a book of things that's going to happen very shortly. You know, the time is near. And then when you get to the end of it, all these insistent messages, I'm coming quickly. And even I imagine, I don't know, it's some kind of rich hyperbole or whatever, but it's basically saying, let the righteous be righteous, let the wicked be wicked. There's no more time. You know what I mean? And it's like, we clearly don't live like that. We clearly don't, you know, let's just let the wickedness magnify and whatever. We don't live like that, but we can see the imminency in Revelation. In fact, I think it's the most imminent book. It's so strongly insistent that this is relevant to an audience in the first century that I don't know how people can miss it. It's actually quite remarkable.
There's a famous commentary written by Hendrickson years ago entitled "These Things Must Shortly Come to Pass." I'm sorry, that was Philip Morrill. And boy, he spends 25 or 30 pages at the very beginning of the commentary saying and emphasizing these things were imminent, they were at hand, they were coming shortly, and it's abuse of hermeneutic to say otherwise. And then what does he do? When he actually begins his commentary, he starts applying it to the 1940s and 1950s of the 20th century. And you're going, wait a minute, what did you just write for 25 or 30 pages? And that happens so commonly, and it's deeply troubling. I'm currently, and I have a TV program every Friday at 9:30 of the morning, and it's on Now TV. And it's called Morning Musings, just like my regular YouTube videos are. And for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years now, I've been on for a good little while. I've been discussing what I call the challenge of Christ. And I have to tell you, Will, when I very began discussing this, the very first time I ever presented a lesson on the challenge of Christ, I was privileged to be in Australia.
Nice.
I've been over there 3 times. Lord willing, nothing happens. I'll be able to go back next year. We're working on the plans now. But as I begin to look at John chapter 10:37, Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Do not believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works. So Jesus staked his entire reputation, his entire ministry on whether he kept his word to do what he was supposed to do. Now, let me illustrate how important that is. Jesus, 6 or 7 times during his personal ministry, said the Son of Man will go up to Jerusalem, he'll be betrayed, crucified, buried, and will rise again the 3rd day. Well, in the first place, that's a really, really, really weird thing to predict. I mean, let's face it, human nature. And every time he said it, his apostles were going, what? What are you talking about? Well, it's a challenging statement. I mean, I'm going to die and be resurrected. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So we all understand that he did say that. And those of us who are Christians, we understand, he kept his word. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul brings that challenge of Christ to bear. And he says, if Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain, and we, that is the apostles, are found to be false witnesses. See, that's a commentary on John 10:37. Do not believe me for my words, believe me for my works.
Yeah.
Okay. But Christ's resurrection is not the only thing that he said he was going to do. He said he was going to come back in the glory of the Father with the angels and reward every man according to his works in the lifetime of the first century generation. And I have to tell you, Will, for several years, probably 15 years, I used to set up a booth at the Abilene Christian University lectureships. It's an annual event. And I had to stop going because of time constraints. But we would set up a booth and we would engage people who would come by and listen to us. And we would share with them the challenge of Christ. What blew me away, it was staggering. Now, mind you, we had students getting ready to get their bachelor's degrees, to get their master's degree, to get their doctorates. We had Bible professors coming by.
Yeah.
Okay. When we would share with them what Jesus said about his challenge and share the scripture about what he predicted, it was literally unbelievable and unbelievably sad at the number of extremely well educated people. And I'm talking Bible professors at that university.
Yeah.
Who would literally go, I never looked at it like that before.
Mm.
Well, then you've never talked to an atheist.
Mm.
You've never talked to a Muslim, an agnostic, a skeptic. Because I'll guarantee you, if you talk to them very often at all,
yeah,
they're going to bring it up. In April of this year, I had about a 2.5 hour debate with a man by the name of Mark Smith. He used to be a minister, a Christian minister. But guess what? He had the same literalistic, Hellenistic view of the language of the Lord coming on the clouds that all the rest of the world did.
Oh yeah, I believe it, and I feel like there's a culture that sort of hems you in, and even though I think a Christian disposition should be to go out and interact with people who think differently and do so in a kind of congenial way, I often feel like Orthodox Christianity will try to avoid the difficult questions because the discomfort and it almost hints at a fragility or a vulnerability,
Oh, yes.
some kind of weakness, and it's like, deal with that. Ask what that is, please. Someone, please. And so that's why I'm encouraged by people like yourself, Don. And I'm curious, like, what kind of...
Let me very quickly make this observation.
Yeah, please.
So many believers today do not fit the mold of first century Christians. And here's what I mean. First century Christians were militantly apologetic. Now, I don't mean they were belligerent. I don't mean they were hostile, but they were militant. They went out and they confronted their friends and their neighbors who were pagans and saying, listen, there's one true God. He has been personified. He has been revealed to us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. We know he was crucified. He was buried. He was raised from the dead. We're witnesses of these realities. You need to come to him. You need to repent. You need to come to him and belong to him. Well, today it's almost well, and listen, I hear this from people. So I'm not imagining this. Well, I'm not very confrontational. I don't like to argue. I don't like to debate people. Well, not everybody is cut out to be an apologist. I was sharing, I had another blog interview earlier this week, and I said, I understand that not everybody is cut out to be a debater. Yeah. My father trained me that way. All right. Yeah. And so I tell people, okay, look, not everybody was born a loudmouth like Don Preston. So, I tend to be, quote, confrontational. I never try to be ugly. I never try to be harsh, critical, or caustic. But I certainly do try to be confrontational. People need to be confronted with truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah. I think that's healthy. I think it's healthy to have a little bit of challenge in there. And I think that's part of the human experience, I think that comes to a question that's often brought up, like the future of Christianity and the implications of preterism, because I think futurism disorientates the believer. And then they come to you and say, well, Don, now I'm disorientated. I had all this stuff I was waiting for. Now what am I supposed to do? And it's almost like there's an anticipation of the human experience fundamentally changing. And I think to the degree to which you would no longer be human. And I think that kind of goes against what the experience is supposed to be of incarnating into this realm. Like human beings have to confront limitation to grow. I'm not saying the world should always be as kind of dramatic and tumultuous as it is today. I've got hope for the future. I really do. But I feel like the limitations are a feature, not a flaw. Some people might make reference to the fall and consider Adam and Eve in the story of how the futility came into the human experience. But I think they make the mistake of thinking that Adam and Eve were these immortal beings. I don't know what your position is on this exactly, but I didn't get the impression that necessarily Adam and Eve were created immortal and would never confront any kind of limitation or interact
I agree.
with. Yeah,
I agree. I think they were created mortal. I know Adam was.
Yeah.
He was created outside the garden, made of dust. He certainly wasn't created as an immortal being. I mean, what is the inherent nature of that which is created from dust? Hello, it's mortality. So, yeah, and I've got to tell a real quick anecdote here. I had a formal public debate with a professor from Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama, back about, I don't know, a few years ago anyway. And prior to the debate, I asked him, was physical death a part of the naturally created order, or was physical death the curse placed upon Adam? And he wrote and he said, oh, it was not the curse. Physical death was part of the natural order of creation. Well, during the debate, I had his quote on a chart, flashing it up there. And I said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, you absolutely must catch the power of what this man has said. He was a good man. But I said, he tells us that physical death is part of the naturally created order. Well, and it existed before sin. Okay. Well, according to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, everything that God created before sin was declared to be good. Therefore, physical death, which according to my opponent existed before sin, physical death was itself good. And I turned to him, I said, you really got to deal with this, because on the one hand, you're admitting that physical death was good. It was not part of the curse. Then you turn around and say, we're waiting for the deliverance from physical death, which is our enemy. How is it our enemy? He would never answer. I mean, he knew he had entrapped himself. And I would point this out. There is a growing number of scholars in the world today who agree with his assessment. That is, physical death existed before sin. Physical death was not the direct result of sin. And I believe that's just pointed out because God said, in the day you eat, you will surely die. Well, guess what? They didn't die physically that day. And the text doesn't say you will begin to die, or it doesn't say you will become mortal. It says, in the day you eat, you will surely die. And
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I just find that incredibly energizing. And I get the sense from you too that you find this stuff so energizing as well. And honestly, and I think it's so important. Like here in Scotland, the national church is failing. It's failing. We're closing down. My local church is 600 years old and it's had to close its doors. You know what I mean? It's such a shame.
Yes.
And I think the reason for that is this kind of conversation that we're having right now is fascinating. It's just patently fascinating. It doesn't matter what worldview you come from. Atheists would be interested in this kind of chat because they're like, wait, what? I never heard of this. This is kind of interesting. And it's like, if only we could make the church this lively place for discussion, but we don't, and we guard it from this. And I feel it creates a callousness around the church from the community, and they need each other. The church needs the community, and if the community has questions, let the questions into the church, and the church should be strong enough. You know what I mean? It should be strong enough. So
I think that historically, let's just face it, historically, and many scholars have pointed this out, the church has never confronted the problem of eschatology. There has never been a single, now I'm not big on the creeds, I'll tell you right now, because creeds are generally the gathering of good-intentioned, well-intentioned men, okay, who have thought, who have considered, who have studied, but they're still uninspired men.
Yeah.
And they bring all of their presuppositions, all of their theological assumptions into that assembly, that council, that creedal meeting. And what may have started out as, okay, here's what we believe is orthodoxy. All of a sudden, the next thing you know, the next generation of believers says, if you disagree with what these men said, you're disagreeing with God.
Yeah.
And this is what I'm confronted with time after time after time of people not only who tell me, well, Don, you're at odds with the church writers. Well, yes, I am. I'm also at odds with the creeds. But one man who constantly attacks me, and yet he will not debate me. He's been challenged to debate me no less than 20 times by actual count, mind you.
Yeah.
He's a scholar. His name's Kenneth Gentry.
Mm-hmm.
I respect Kenneth a great deal. He's very cordial. He and I have been on the same dais to speak, very friendly, okay, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But Kenneth Gentry loves to say the historical and the creedal problem with full preterism. He wrote an article on that just recently, condemning preterism because preterism violates the creeds. Well, I wrote a response. Actually, I've written several responses to Kenneth, pointing out here is Kenneth Gentry, who believes, teaches, and has written extensively on the fact that the book of Revelation was written prior to the fall of Jerusalem and was predictive of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Yeah.
Now, he currently has a humongous 2-volume set, his magnum opus, on the book of Revelation. I ordered mine months and months and months ago. I still don't have them. But I know what he says in his commentary. He says in his commentary that the new heaven and new earth of Revelation chapter 21 is not the end of time. It's not a literal, physical, recreated earth. It is the new creation of the redeemed church that came into being full bloom in AD 70 with the fall of Jerusalem.
Great.
Well, from my perspective, he just gave away the farm, the dog, the cat, the goldfish, the gerbil. I mean, he just gave it all away by saying that. And here's what I said in the article that I wrote in response to him. Kenneth Gentry says that preterists are wrong because we don't conform to the creeds. Yet Kenneth Gentry violates the creeds by his position on the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Kenneth Gentry violates the creeds by saying, well, the man of sin was alive in the first century, and it was probably the Jewish high priesthood. Well, guess what? The Westminster Confession of Faith identifies the Catholic Church and a Roman Catholic Pope as the man of sin and the beast.
Yeah.
And that's what Revelation is all about. So here's Kenneth Gentry. He condemns full preterists because we're non-creedal. He is every bit as much non-creedal as any full preterist because he rejects the eschatology of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, that's okay for him to do that, you see.
Yeah. And I think this is the frustration that you're going to confront as you meet these people who are intelligent and creative individuals, but they're sort of hamstrung by this allegiance to something that doesn't even have, like divine inspiration within it. Really, right. It's just other men's ideas, and they're like, well, I'm going to throw all my chips in with them, and yet you can still see they're using their intellect to bring out some nice truth. They just can't integrate it into the larger narrative, to make the cogent point, because they're stuck on this orthodoxy, which has disorientated them. And I think they know that. I think they must feel some of that unease that comes, that cognitive dissonance, where it's like, I've seen you sit down in a debate. I forget the guy's name now. He's a Messianic Jew, and it was James T. White or something that was moderating it. And you were having
Michael Brown.
Yeah, Michael Brown.
Yeah.
And I could see, like, these guys recognize that Don has something here. They recognize it. They're impressed by the way you're synthesizing it, but they're just going to write it off and say, "Oh, well, Don's a master at cherry picking. That's what that is."
Yeah,
and it's like I don't think he's cherry picking. I think he's chainsawed the tree down and he's got it in his backyard. Come on, like, I think we should listen here. So yeah, what do you think about the direction of modern scholarship? Do you think it's still sort of captured by the futurist kind of mindset?
Oh, this is such a good question. Let me share something with you. In October the 12th, I am due to debate a scholar by the name of Richard Carrier.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I'm due to debate him. Okay. So he and I started corresponding, and once we got the propositions confirmed, he and I started corresponding seriously last or last week, first of the week.
Interesting.
And I said, I just need some clarification on where you are, because the proposition reads something like this: insofar as the New Testament record properly and accurately records the words of Jesus, his predictions of his coming failed. Okay. And so I wanted to make sure that Richard Carrier was not going to enter this debate saying, well, I don't believe Mark's record is truly accurate. I don't believe I believe the manuscript's been changed. I'm not interested in all of that. I accept the biblical record as it stands.
Hmm.
And so I told him, I said, look, I'm not interested in textual criticism debate. I said, I accept the text as it reads in our Bibles today.
Yeah.
And he wrote back and he said, well, okay, that's fine. I agree with that. I think that's the proper approach to this debate. And he said, you need to know. And then, look, I just about fell out of my chair when I read this, because he says he is in conformity with the rest of scholarship. Okay.
Hmm.
And he said, I stand in agreement with the great majority of modern scholars who believe that Jesus's predictions of his coming are tied to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Okay. Okay.
Do you catch the power of what he just admitted?
Yikes. Yeah.
He just admitted that Jesus was predicting he was coming in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. He just gave away half the debate.
Yeah.
The only thing left is to discuss the nature of the coming of Christ.
Hmm.
We've got the timing down. We've got full agreement on the timing. Okay, so what did Jesus mean when he said he was going to come in the glory of the Father? Well, I've written a book on that. Like Father, like Son, on clouds of glory. I would, urge your viewers to check out my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. And I understand that shipping to Scotland is very, very expensive. So what I do for some people, based upon certain agreements, is I will sell PDFs, or I sell, for instance, audios of that particular book. I have a complete MP3 audio of that book, which can be shipped a whole lot less expensively, than a paperback.
Well, it was worth it. I did that. I got We Shall Meet Him in the Air. That was a good book.
Yeah, and that would be really expensive to ship over to Scotland. The thing weighs over a pound, so it could get rather expensive. So the point here being, when Richard Carrier admits that the great majority of scholars today are positing the coming of the Lord, at least the prediction of it, at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, this is staggering. If you go back 50 years in scholarship, you didn't find any scholars agreeing with that. I'm currently involved in a discussion with a scholar by the name of Elton Holland. Great guy, very cordial, very friendly, very scholarly. He stands at odds with that view, thinking that Jesus, on the one hand, predicted the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. On the other hand, he predicted his coming at the end of time. Well, I categorically disagree with that. And Richard Carrier says most scholars disagree with that.
Yeah, there you go.
So it's absolutely amazing what's been happening in scholarship over the last 30, 40 years.
Wow.
As the shift is going on of scholars agreeing that Jesus's prediction of his coming pointed to AD 70. Now, one of my very favorite authors of the day, Scott McKnight, wrote a book entitled A New Vision for Israel. In that book, he said, in his eschatological horizon, Jesus saw no further than AD 70. Okay, well, then he was either right or wrong. Well, McKnight understands he just entrapped himself. If Jesus didn't see any further than AD 70, then since the end of time, which Scott McKnight believes Jesus actually believed in, if that didn't happen in AD 70, then that must mean that Jesus was wrong. So even though he says, okay, in his eschatological horizon, Jesus saw no further than AD 70, but that doesn't mean he was wrong. Really?
That's it. It's this contradiction within. And look, people like N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of Christ. Within that text, I've seen things like these people seem to get it. They seem to understand the timeline, but they just can't get there. There's something withholding them, and it's that allegiance to,
Give me one moment. I've got to catch the door over here.
No,
Hang
please,
on. Yeah,
please
I'll be right back.
Yeah, I'll just continue that. Like, I feel N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of Christ, it's hinting at that. It's definitely showing that the end that Jesus was foreseeing was 70 AD. It's strongly implied. But then I feel like there's this, I don't know if the term ideological possession is too strong, but that's certainly what I feel. So I just want to thank people for being in the audience right now. I'm reading your comments, by the way. I just don't want to start like reading out your comments in the middle of Don speaking, but it's good to see you all. Thank you, David, for being here. Red Devil Studio, good to see you. Yeah, it's an absolute privilege having Don with us today. It was one of the best live on topic chat from Don too. Well, it was always going to be, David. It was always going to be the best one. Yeah. Yesterday, I even apologized to my unbeliever friends that I was wrong about the rapture and that the end was coming. I'm actually embarrassed. Yeah. Me too, Paul. I've been there. It can be embarrassing, just one of those things. Alrighty.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. Just let me chat with the audience. So yeah, I'm actually quite encouraged to hear about the direction of the modern scholarship there, and hopefully, as we continue to discuss this topic, we can inspire scholars coming up to contribute their knowledge and wisdom to this body. We've got the. I think we touched on the purpose and effectiveness of debate, and you say you've been trained in that way. And I remember going right back. I forget how long ago it was now. I saw you on Sean McCraney up there in Salt Lake City, and I thought you did really well. And I think you know what I think sometimes the allegiance to orthodoxy does, and it almost makes the critic of preterism come across quite poorly, is there's a inherent haughtiness that I think is sometimes inescapable for some people, because I'm speaking from the position of a thought orthodoxy. I see you as a heretic. I'm immediately looking down my nose at you, and it just does not come across well at all. I mean, if I was going to give any advice to futurists, it's just be more cordial, be more congenial. Just don't go in there like, I'm going to get this guy, because that's not how it works.
I think that's great advice. And, I very often turn down debate challenges because when I do a little bit of investigation of the person that's issued the challenge, I discover that they're haughty, as you're saying, they're caustic, they engage in name calling. Well, as I tell people all the time, if you can't conduct yourself as a Christian gentleman, I don't want anything to do with you, honestly. Mm-hmm. And you really shouldn't be on a debate platform, whether that's on the internet or in person. If you can't conduct yourself in a right way, then no, I will not debate you. And unfortunately, I've had one or two debates in which in our negotiations, the person was just, cordial and friendly and respectful. And then when they get on the debate platform, all of a sudden they did a 180 and they were ugly. They were awful. Yeah. And now that came back to bite them as far as the audience was concerned. Yeah. One debate I had, my opponent just got up and he carried a walking stick with him. And the platform was a wooden stage. And boy, he would pound that walking stick on that stage and he'd point his finger at me and point that stick at me and just, you need to repent, Preston. You did this. And he just carried on.
Oh, my goodness.
And I even told him, I said, well, obviously you are trying to intimidate me, but I said, I would just simply say this: better men than you have tried to intimidate me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I said, you might as well give that up and act like you're supposed to.
Mm.
After the debate, a whole group of people, I mean, there's probably 6 or 7 people walked up to me. They were from a congregation that opposed me. Okay. They
Mm-hmm.
helped sponsor him. But their spokesman said, we want to apologize to you for his conduct.
Wow.
And
Wow.
we want to commend you for your Christian decorum. We
Well, there
don't
you
agree with you at all,
go.
but
Mm-hmm.
you conducted yourself as a Christian gentleman ought to conduct themselves in a formal debate. And we want to express our appreciation for that.
And that's that, Jesus said you will know them by their fruits. So come on, people, display the fruits. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, that's that.
that's
Um,
exactly right.
if you had to give a sort of succinct mission statement for Preterist Research Institute there in Oklahoma, what would you say it is? What's your mission?
Well, my mission is to demonstrate that Christ is the Son of God because he kept his word,
Mm-hmm.
and that the scriptures are inspired, they're reliable, they're trustworthy, and they genuinely are the words of life for us today.
Mm.
That preterism is the only viable answer to atheism, to Judaism, to Islam, because all of those separate and disparate groups point the finger at Jesus and say he was a failure,
Yeah.
and some more aggressively than others.
Mm-hmm.
This I mentioned that I had this debate in April of this year with this guy named Mark Smith. He was ugly, you know, even though the moderator had told him, I'm not going to put up with any, bad activities here.
Yeah.
Well, he did. He put
Mm.
up with it, and he apologized to me afterward. He said, I don't know why I allowed that. Should never have allowed him to act like he did toward you. And he said, I don't know if I'll ever have him back on my show again as a result of that.
Mm.
And, was complimenting the way I did that. But the point of this is, here is a guy that was once a Christian
Yeah.
and became an atheist
Mm.
as a result of believing that Jesus failed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to tell you, I hear from people on a very, very, very regular basis who were
Mm-hmm.
raised in an environment of Hal Lindsey, of Harold Camping,
Yes.
Jack Van Impe. Oh, it's this generation, absolutely positively sure.
Oh, they got the red heifer, Don. They got the red heifer.
They've got the red heifer. Well, actually, they don't, but that's really interesting. They shipped those 5 red heifers over to Israel. Oh, look, we're going to get a red heifer out of them. Well, 3 of them have already been disqualified because they grew white or black hair, and
Yeah.
the other 2 are getting too old.
Yeah.
They got to be a certain age,
This is
and we don't even know if they'll have white or black hairs. So every time they come up with something and tell us, this is it, this is proof that we're in the end,
yeah.
something happens to nullify that.
Mm-hmm.
But the point being, the full preterist view is the only view of eschatology that has the ability to stand toe to toe, eyeball to eyeball with the skeptics,
Yes,
and
I agree.
and to say Jesus did not fail. He kept his word. He is the Son of God. He met his own challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that his apostles, who wrote the same things that he said, they are true. The Bible is true. We can trust the Bible. It truly does have the words of life.
Yeah. I remember being 11 years old, and my good friend at school at that time, he turned around to me around the year 2000 and he said, well, the Bible's obviously fake. And I was like, what do you mean? Jesus said he would return at the year 2000. Now, it doesn't say that, but you get all these people making predictions. Jesus is coming 2014, 2017, 2018. There's several blood moons. The blood moons are there. And it's like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's just nonsense, man. It's nonsense. And it's not a good thing to base your faith upon either. You know what I mean? It needs to come from richer stuff, a significant, relationship with God. You can't base it on all these prophecies and and yet you get these con men, and some people are, it's not being impolite to say that, there are con men out there who will rinse you and try and, you know, accumulate wealth to themselves based off of these prophecies. And that's the most disturbing thing ever. I can't imagine.
It's horrific. And I've read a lot of Hal Lindsey's works. I know what he said about the timing of the coming of the Lord, the rapture, the great tribulation, et cetera, et cetera. And he put it for the 1980s. You cannot read his works, you know, 1980s, Countdown to Armageddon, The Late Great Planet Earth, Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. You can't read those books and misunderstand what he was saying about the timing. And it was going to be in the 1980s. Well, if you remember when the Berlin Wall came down, Russia was disintegrating. I sat and watched Hal Lindsey say, I predicted this very thing. This is precisely what I've been saying all along. And I have to tell you, Will, I literally came up out of my chair, pointing my finger at the TV going, you are a liar.
Yes. Yeah.
Now that's strong language.
That's true.
He never said anything like that, never even close to it. Mm-hmm. And so for him to get on national TV and claim to the world, I predicted these very things, so you got to send me some more money and buy some more of my books. And that's what it's all about.
Honestly, it's shocking, man. And if I might borrow a phrase, I caught the power of something that I want to do, right? Because in Luke 21:8, Jesus says, do not follow people who say the time is near when it's not. That's the clear express, you know, that's what he's saying. And so not only is that bad for these people today who keep saying the time is near, but that also makes Paul, Peter, James, John, even Jesus himself, false prophets not to be followed, because they all said, little children, it's the last hour. Our salvation draws closer than we first believed. All these statements, he who is coming shall come in a very, very little. We have all these statements of imminency. And so if Jesus has told us in Luke 21:8, do not follow these people who say the time is drawn near, you know, then, you know, you disqualify the apostles, you know, and so we need to see things. That's why it's so important. And like you said, like the mission statement of Preterist Research Institute, or more Oklahoma there, is about showing the validity of Christ's claims. I'm curious about the Preterist Pilgrim Weekend that you've been hosting over a few years now. What's the future of that? Is that getting momentum? Is it finding its place?
Well, unfortunately, we can't do that anymore because my wife's health, of course, she was in charge of one half of the logistics of that, you know, the meals, the catering, getting people to help with setup. And
that's lovely.
And unfortunately, my wife's health is not real good. And it has been for a while. Hasn't been. She's a 2-time cancer survivor. You know, she's got diverticulitis, and she just got a lot of problems. Bless her heart. She's tough as a boot, but to go through the planning and the functioning of one of those lectureship seminars, it was just too much stress on her, and she's just not able to do it anymore.
Well, more power to her. I think she did wonderfully, and I think you did wonderfully too. And it's really nice that you're doing that with your wife as well, and that you were able to host that. And I'm sure there'll be something like that again in the future. You know, it sounds like there's momentum behind Preterism, and you know, I think your voice resonates quite loudly there. So, thank you to you and your wife for hosting that, because it's always, you know, it's an interesting thing to see, and for your continued.
Well, I will say this: there's an upcoming lectureship in Jonesboro, Arkansas, next to the last weekend in August. You can do a Google on it, Arkansas Eschatology lectureship.
Nice one.
They're expecting 300 people.
Nice.
Their seating is already sold out. I don't know if they're going to be able to get any additional seating or not, but nonetheless, the interest in this seminar is very, very high. And I've been privileged and honored to be invited to speak on that.
That's fantastic.
One of my lectureships will be the Great Tribulation and the Resurrection. The other lecture will be on Daniel 9 and the end of the millennium. And so I'm very excited about this. Will be the very first lectureship that I've been able to speak at since COVID.
Wow.
Uh, my,
Wow.
my,
Yeah.
yeah, my wife and I both caught COVID the very first time around, and
Oof, yeah.
it just about got us.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were extremely sick, and then we each had it twice since then. But
Wow.
neither time compared to the first one, I can tell you that,
Oh
and that
gosh.
we're thankful for that. So anyway, well, listen, Will, I apologize for this, but my time is short.
No, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you, Don. And yeah, maybe we can talk sometime in the future. That'd be lovely if we could.
Certainly so. And thank you for the privilege. Thank you for the invitation.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I'll speak to you later.
Bye bye.
Bye bye now. Alrighty, guys. Speak to you later.